Welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I am Doug Keck, your host, and our guest is Dr. James Hitchcock, an old friend of EWTN. His book is Abortion, Religious Freedom, and Catholic Politics, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. It's great to have you here.
Always glad to be here,
It's been a number
Doug.
of years since I've got to
Yes, it has.
speak to you in person. Back earlier last year, you were on with Father Mitch Pacwa on his show. And, of course, your wonderful wife was a member of the EWTN board, your late wife, for many, many years. And, and I considered her a good friend. And she was great with Adoramus. She was responsible greatly for why that hymnal came out, as well as the Adoramus bulletin.
Women for Faith and Family.
Women for Faith and Family. Yes. So there was, you guys were a team there.
Yes, indeed.
Well, let me ask you, in the two of you, in your zeal for the Catholic faith. Now, she was Helen Hull was actually a convert to the faith. But did you guys work together on most projects? Did you tend to do things separately? How did that work?
Do it separately.
Okay.
She, under Women for Faith and Family, she had her own office in another building, and I always worked from home. But even before that, she worked in the basement, and I worked on the third floor.
Okay. Well, you know, it's interesting because years ago, and I think I've told you this the first time I met you, I was what Scott Hahn used to call a tapeworm. I'd listen to audio tapes about the faith while I was doing something at home. And so in the very early 90s, I still recall mowing the lawn in my backyard, listening to you on Mother Angelica, talking about secular humanism. That was the topic. And
one of my earlier books.
Right, and I thank you very much for you educating me on some of that. Well, let's talk about abortion, religious freedom, and Catholic politics. That's a topic you know Catholics would talk about on a regular basis. Obviously, you're a historian. You've got a great background on that. But it's interesting the way you formatted this book, because you juxtapose the National Catholic Reporter, not the Register, not our paper, but the Reporter, which tends to be seen on the left, and the Wanderer, which tends to be seen on the right. My question is, were you looking to talk about the Catholic left and the Catholic right, and these were good devices? Or did this come out of seeing the two of these and realizing there was something to be compared there?
Well, I was a regular reader of both, and I became aware of what a sharp contrast it really was. And then I thought, you know, since I'm a regular reader and I mark it up as I'm reading, I've already got most of the material here that I need. And it probably won't take all that long to write a book. Of course, it always takes longer than you think it will, but still.
Right. Now, in 1976 is the first time you voted Republican, and you're from Missouri, and you make that point in the preface. And why is that important to your change in perspective, at least politically?
Well, it's very good illustration, because while I was changing, so was the state. In 1973, when Roe versus Wade came out, all the prominent Democrats in Missouri, and I list them here, were pro-life. And then by 1976, they were all gone, and everybody had become pro-abortion. And in the process, Missouri went from being Democratic to being Republican. So it's a very good example of how the Democrats kicked away a large part of their support.
Right. It's interesting, too, because you talk about in the book about the whole idea of the Catholic Church in relation to the Democratic Party, the immigrants, the union support, those kinds of things, and how, in a sense, that changed in the 60s because they tended to throw off the kind of that blue-collar kind of worker thing for the more elitist kind of revolutionary approach to politics.
Exactly. 68 is the big year.
Right.
And the way I would summarize it sort of simplistically is the party after 1968, above all, is committed to the sexual revolution. Feminism, gay rights, abortion, that becomes no longer the economic issues. You know, they'll take a liberal position on economic issues, but that's not what's important. And if they alienate blue-collar voters, too bad, you know, because that's not what's important.
Is that why we had the quote-unquote Nixon silent majority there at the time?
Exactly.
Which obviously, if it wasn't for the Watergate thing, might not have turned around quite as quickly.
I believe it was 1980, I forget which year it was, when it was an off-year election, and a lot of prominent liberal Democrats were voted out of office, and for the first time, people realized how powerful the pro-life movement was. Right.
Well, you've got the '76 election with Carter, then '78 might have been off year, but before the '80 Reagan election, right? Of course. Now, in the introduction here, you make a point. Throughout much of American history, Catholics as a group, in contrast to some Protestant churches, remain politically inactive, playing no significant role in the debate, and you say, for example, over slavery. Now, why were Catholics, in your view, inactive?
For one thing, they were very much split. And really, the dominant tone of American Catholicism, you have to say at that time, would have been pro-slavery, because you had a lot of Catholics in Louisiana, Maryland. Those were big Catholic states. There were a few outspoken members of the hierarchy who were anti-slavery. But the Archbishop of Baltimore, Francis Kenrick, who wrote a moral theology text, justified slavery in that book, contrary to what the popes had been saying on that same subject. And the Dred Scott decision was handed down by a Catholic Chief Justice, Roger Taney.
Right. You talk about our reliance on natural law, and you talk about social issues that were later seen as distinctively Catholic. Contraception, abortion, homosexuality were hardly even discussed in large society because there was an overall agreement, right?
Yeah, exactly.
There was. But then you say this moral consensus began to ravel in the 1920s, came under increasingly aggressive attack after World War II. Well, the 20s, is it the disillusionment after World War I into the Roaring 20s? And what was it in World War II that you saw?
I don't know that there was anything in the war itself that had that effect, but it is a convenient dividing point, because immediately afterwards, 1947, you get the first of these church-state decisions on the part of the Supreme Court, in which they claim that the Constitution mandates absolute separation of church and state, which of course it doesn't. And it's like they're already in 1947. Now we're ready to move on to the next stage. There had been a major change in the membership of the Supreme Court over the previous 10 years, and that now manifests itself in 1947.
You even talk about the fact that this moral divide that hit the country cut through organized religion itself. How so?
Well, what we might now call the liberal churches, which would be Episcopalians, Presbyterians, United Church of Christ, and so forth, at first were rather deeply split between conservative and liberal wings, but then they became overwhelmingly liberal. It would be pretty hard today to find a militant Episcopalian who was strongly opposed to abortion. There are some, but they're very few in number.
You also make the point that throughout its history, the Catholic Church has also been concerned about another kind of social issue, the material well-being of all people as enjoined by Christ's command to love one's neighbor, a concern that has usually been expressed more in terms of charity, alleviating suffering, than of justice. And how do we see that impact today?
Well, we live under what's called, broadly speaking, the welfare state, which means the government is going to take responsibility for all the ways in which the citizens are in need, or at least appear to be in need. Now, that's consonant with traditional Catholic social teaching up to a point, because traditional Catholic social teaching also says it ought to be the goal of the welfare state to make people independent as much as possible, and they can't take responsibility for every aspect of people's lives. The welfare state tends to be what I would call an octopus. So it's going to help you economically, but then it wants to get in there and talk about the education your children are receiving. It wants to be poking into every aspect of social life. And that's inexorable. As long as people keep supporting an expanding state, that's going to happen.
You talk about the advent of the capitalist industrial system around 1800 changed the terms of discussion in a number of ways. You say the system tended to discourage charity as undermining the spirit of hard work and self-reliance. Okay. Then you go on to say classical liberalism, because it placed freedom of economic activity on par with freedom of speech and religion, all such freedoms being liberation from previously repressive authority.
Yeah, well, the word liberal, the meaning of the word liberal has changed considerably. In the 19th century and well into the 20th century, it meant freedom, but the way in which it was most emphasized was, okay, I'm a businessman and I'm free to pretty much do whatever I want as long as it's consistent with the market. Then around the 1930s with the New Deal, the meaning of liberalism came to be, no, the government now is going to protect you from bad things, including the irresponsible businessman, the irresponsible employer. So there's a 180-degree turn there in the meaning of the word liberal. And economic liberty, economic freedom, the free market, then comes to be separated from the others. So the people who were militant about freedom of speech will not be very militant about the free market. That's the division that has just come about.
You're saying many Catholics were also cool to this new system. You're going to say most economically advanced nations, interesting, England, the Netherlands, Switzerland, were Protestant.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and some of the popes, Leo XIII is a bit of an exception to this, an innovator. Many of the earlier popes were very cool, if not hostile, to the new industrial system. Because they could see how it was disrupting society. That things were changing drastically, with factories and railroads and everything that went with that. And they tended to prefer the traditional agrarian way of life in which people were close to the soil and probably integrated into little villages. So the Catholic Church was a little bit slow in relating to the new economy.
You say, talking about the United States, you talk about earlier in this section here in the introduction about Roe versus Wade, you said, had the abortion issue been foreseen in 1960, it would have been assumed that the Republicans, predominantly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants with a tinge of eugenics in their history, were the pro-abortion party, while Catholic Democrats were solidly pro-life.
Yeah.
But of course, that's not the way it was.
It turned out not to be the case.
Right.
Now, this is...
And you talk about in the book, very interestingly, how we got there.
Yeah, how we got there. And people don't know this, but John F. Kennedy, before he died, had privately told a reporter that he was pro-abortion. Then he said, don't talk about that. This is not very commonly known, but I allude to it in the book, that President Eisenhower in the 1950s was behind the scenes talking about the possibility of population control, distribution of contraceptives, possibility of abortion. The leading Republicans were moving in that direction.
Right. You say that although pro-lifers have sometimes been accused of blind loyalty to the Republican Party, the devotion of liberal Catholics to the Democratic Party is even more problematic now.
It is.
Why do you say that?
Well, because they just have to more or less flatly contradict. Oh, I'm pro-life. I fully accept. But on the other hand, I'm going to always vote in such a fashion as to make abortions easier to get. On the point about the Republicans, I like to think that the Republicans, when the pro-life movement came along, said, "What hit us? What hit us?" All of a sudden, who were all these pro-life people? The bishops have sometimes been accused of having been co-opted by the Republican Party. I think it was the other way around.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
I don't
Republican Party.
I was there, obviously the reporter's perspective on the left is, of course, that's what was going on.
Yeah. Yeah, and I imagine there have been a lot of Republican politicians even today who think, oh my God, how did I get this albatross put around my neck?
Well, you make the point in the book about all of the pro-choice, pro-death, pro-abortion Catholics.
Yeah.
And these days, you could say when some politician gets up and says he's pro-life, the bet is he's not Catholic.
Yeah,
He's probably evangelical.
Yeah.
And that's pretty sad.
I can't offhand name any prominent pro-life Democratic politician. There are some that aren't all that prominent, but there's no prominent pro-life Democrat.
Well, last year they came out with that statement basically with the new head of the DNC basically saying you really
exactly,
can't be.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, you've got to get over it.
That I think was in reference to a mayor of Omaha. So it was extending that far down
into actually an election, right.
Yeah.
Now, you also talk about the fact here, and you talk about it later in relation to Vatican II, you say committed liberal Catholics seek a kind of revolution in their church. What's that revolution?
Well, see, this, from reading the National Catholic Reporter again, this carries over out of politics into religion, because you get a lot of liberal Catholics now who say, the bishops are backwards, the bishops are dogmatic, the bishops have thrown in their lot with the Republican Party, they're opposed to gay rights. We just have to have a different kind of church. Let's have more of a lay-governed church in which the bishops don't have the last word, in which we go a little bit easy on doctrine. That has now carried over from politics into religion.
Well, you're a historian, and the thing that always I question is, even if you believe that to be true, and a lot of us who grew up in the 60s thought some of these ideas sounded good at the time, later on it proved to not be true. But other mainline Protestant churches have done all of those things.
Yes.
And it's been a disaster for them. So why do we think, is it our own hubris to think somehow it'll be different for us?
I think so. I often say to liberal Catholics, I've got good news for you. The church exists. the one you want exists. It's called the Episcopal Church.
Right,
Go down the street.
Well, you better hurry up because it's disappearing.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Right.
But the reason they won't do that, I mean, some do, but the reason they don't do that is I say it's kind of a little resentment. I'm a Catholic. This is my church, and by gosh, I'm going to make it do what I want it to do.
In chapter 1, when you go in and you talk about the Catholic left, you talk about the idea that the whole pro-abortion thing, made some liberal Catholics who were committed to the Democratic Party but were uneasy with abortion. And then you say in 1983, Cardinal Joseph Bernardine of Chicago, then the most influential member of the American hierarchy, addressed this concern, their concern with dealing with abortion, proposing a consistent ethic of life issues, thereafter dubbed the seamless garment. Explain that to us. What is the seamless garment?
Well, the seamless garment, as it was called, was that anything that affected human life. That would be abortion, euthanasia, capital punishment, war, go down the line. We have respect for human life, and therefore we need to be consistent all the way across the board. Practically speaking, if you're anti-abortion, you should really almost be a pacifist. You should be against capital punishment. Well, that was an arguable position, but the biggest weakness with the position was there wasn't anybody who fit that description. All the liberals who may have checked 4 of the 5 boxes were pro-abortion, and many of the conservatives who checked the pro-life box were conservative on the other issues.
Right.
So whatever Cardinal Bernardine was trying to do, it was not realistic.
Well, it's interesting because you say that not only was Bernardine's formally considered a moral advance on the single issue agenda, which of course you point out the pro-lifers are always accused of being, and in some ways you actually say when it started off it was a single issue. But liberal Catholics predicted that it would make the anti-abortion stance itself more credible by showing the Catholics generally revered human life in all its stages. So even if that was the intent, it seemed like it had the exact opposite
Absolutely.
effect, right?
So yeah, I mean, people do not look at Nancy Pelosi, they don't look at Patrick Leahy, they don't look at Teddy Kennedy, any of Mario Cuomo, any of those people and say, aren't Catholics wonderful? Look how liberal they are. It just shows that the Catholic Church is caving in. That's the way they interpret that effect.
Well, you talk about the fact Catholic Senator Edward Kennedy, who claimed to be personally opposed to abortion, etc. You talk about the idea that the rhetoric in the seamless garment, Catholic liberals condemn Republicans for adhering to their conservative social, economic principles, in effect for not becoming liberal Democrats. Yeah. And what about the whole thing? Was it, we hear Mario Cuomo, the kind of, where the whole personally opposed. Did that come out of the Jesuit meeting with the Kennedys up in Boston or in Hyannis, wherever it was?
Yeah.
Or was it came out later, we hear about the thing with Cuomo out of Notre Dame? This whole, I'm personally opposed, but.
Well, I think these Catholic politicians, you refer to the meeting with the Jesuits, kind of a semi-secret event that happened in which a group of Jesuit theologians assured Bobby Kennedy and Teddy Kennedy that it was all right to support pro-abortion legislation. Other Democrats, I think, got the message. Okay, you see, our most liberal theologians now think this is all right. Mario Cuomo is an interesting case because, unlike the Kennedys, he really considered himself a kind of a theologian. Teddy Kennedy, Jack Kennedy said, "I won't let my religion interfere with politics." Cuomo thought of himself as truly understanding what Catholicism.
Well, didn't he have Thomas More's?
Yeah, exactly.
Painting on the wall.
And he's a perfect
office.
example of someone who, going from politics, is now going to change the church. But lurking in the background was this semi-secret meeting with a group of Jesuit theologians who said it's okay to go down that route. And what's most amazing here is it was this deep, deep loyalty to the Democratic Party. What do we have to do to enable us to continue to be the good Democrats? We'll trim our principles any way we have to. Right. And that's what they were being told to do.
Well, and then you start, as you go further into the book, you start quoting various articles by various reporters from the National Catholic Reporter, like Tim Unsworth, etc. You talk about how they dismissed Justices Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas with liberal cliche that they were to the right of Attila the Hun. There's a nun named Regina
Gnat or something.
Gnat, how she pronounces her name, professed her support of the seamless garment, but lowered the dialogue to a new level of crudity by characterizing pro-lifers as people out there who long for the good old days when you keep women barefoot and pregnant.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of those most outrageous feminist ideas, you know, that the men really just want to keep women under their thumb. And so here's a Catholic nun who's coming out and saying that. Of course, this is a period of time when religious life was in great crisis, and people were, I have one in there from a Trappist monk who he's locked up in his monastery, and he's writing letters about how terrible it is, how are we going to ever get rid of George Bush, and so forth. You know, how does that consonant with the vocation of a Trappist monk?
Right. You talk about liberal Catholics have made capital punishment one of their favorite moral issues, considering themselves to be prophetic witnesses against a callous and vindictive society. You know, if we look at capital punishment, how many people actually suffer under it?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
To say we could say that it's wrong and I can't support it, that sounds fine. But you first of all, you're not necessarily talking about the innocent,
yes,
though DNA evidence has become more of an issue over the years.
Yeah, and most of the people who do suffer capital punishment have in fact done something wrong,
right.
Whereas the unborn are completely blameless.
Clearly blameless. You also go into here, and people would have to read the book about the Shiavo case and how that was played out even in the church. You talk about the Bishop Robert Lynch and his kind of position on it, or lack of position on
lack
it.
of same. That was very, very disappointing.
Right, exactly. But this was interesting because we talk about capital punishment, and Sister Helen Prejean, who's always brought up, you know, an opponent of the death penalty, officially accuses pro-lifers of inconsistency on that issue, even though she's never been able to bring herself to declare that abortion is wrong.
To the best of my knowledge, I tried checking around on that,
right.
And could not find any instance where she said abortion is wrong. And I think when that happens, it's pretty good to imply that people don't think it is wrong.
Right, and they're just trying to figure out how to veneer it without ticking off their supporters. Do you find in reading through the book, and of course you also talk about the right as well, though I have to say that it was kind of interesting to see the left. You've got Andrew Greeley's name pops up in here. Again, I haven't heard his name in a while. The whole issues with Humane Vitae, there's so many different things to talk about. But one of the things also that we obviously been dealing with in the last few years with the Obama administration, you talk about Doug Kimmick in here as well. People might remember that name. But Sister Carol Keehan.
Oh, yeah.
And we actually did a lot. Raymond Royal the world over. We had her on our show talking about the whole Catholic Health Association support and things like that, and how she supported Kathleen Sebelius, who was a nice Catholic, you know, and we know where that ended up.
Yeah, exactly.
Are they totally blind, or is it they actually believe these things?
I think they believe them, and actually with the case of Sister Carol and the Catholic Health Association, I would introduce a more cynical element. Our charitable institutions are heavily dependent upon government funding. You know, Catholic Health Association.
More so than we realize.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And however, you know, she's here, she's there, she's against it, she's in favor of it. She's maneuvering it around to make sure that she does not burn her bridges to the Obama administration. Because millions and millions of dollars are pouring into Catholic health.
In fact, if people knew at the time, there had been threats about withdrawing that as well. So that had already been raised up as an issue. And like you say, and you talk about it in the book, you realize how many people working in certain instances you have in the book with specific organizations where some of the people working there's perspective on Catholic theology seems a little light, to say the least.
Well, there was an incident where a woman who was employed by some Catholic agency actually deliberately ran down someone in Marked for Life in Washington and was later on convicted of assault. And she remained on the payroll.
Right. Just before we go, because we're just about out of time, you talk about the Catholic left, the donkeys make over the Democratic Party, but you say generally forgotten in all of this was the principle, and this is a church principle, of subsidiarity.
Yeah.
Why is that important, and what does it mean?
This principle of subsidiarity means problems should be handled by the most immediate community. So it would be the family, then maybe the parish, the village, the town, the state. Finally, you get to the federal government, then beyond that, international agencies. But liberalism in our day has meant pretty much denying that whole principle. You go immediately to the federal government, and increasingly we're going beyond that to international agencies. And of course, the further away it gets, the less any individual person less influence they have on what's going on.
Right, and in a lot of ways it takes away the opportunity to be charitable.
Exactly.
Because the
absolutely.
expectation now is that the government will be charitable for us.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, and the church gets superseded by the government.
Yeah, exactly.
As the family is
Right.
as well, right.
And not only are the government paying the bills, but then the government is now looked upon benignly. You know, instead of saying, well, here's a kindly father, a kindly priest, it's the kindly government agent.
Right. We have the friendly Leviathan. Things
Yes,
have changed. Well, thank you
exactly.
so much.
Thank you.
Dr. Hitchcock, author of Abortion, Religious Freedom, and Catholic Politics, a very interesting read available through the EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. Check it out. Check us out next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck. Thanks.